Welcome, everybody. It's terrific to have such a turnout tonight in the midst of this campaign. And before you go any further, I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. Well, here we are, almost halfway through this 6-week election campaign. It's quite a long time. I don't know how it's feeling to you. So 3 weeks in, how much wiser are we about the competing visions of the major parties, and are they actually offering much vision at all so far? To reflect on what we've learnt to this point and where the campaign goes from here, I'd like to introduce you to our panel this evening. Duncan Ivison is Professor of Political Philosophy and was, just until this month, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Sydney for the past 6.5 years or so. Anika Gauja is Professor of Politics here at Sydney University. Welcome. Elizabeth Hill is Associate Professor of the Department of Political Economy and Deputy Director of the Gender Equality in Working Life Initiative. Kishor Napier-Raman is a federal politics reporter at Crikey, former editor of Sydney Uni's newspaper On Histoire. And of course, Antony Green knows no introduction. He's the ABC's election analyst. We like to call him Mr. Election around the ABC, but he is also adjunct professor at Sydney Uni. So welcome all of you. Could you please welcome the panel? And just to let you know, there will be a little bit of time at the end of this hour or so for questions from you. We've got some roving mics, but if you prefer to send it in on Slido, your question, I'll be tracking them, or if you're watching this online, just file your questions in through Slido. Again, thank you all of you for joining us. I want to start with a question to each of our panellists. I'll start with you, Duncan, and I'll just go around the grounds here. In one sentence, what's your impression of this election campaign so far? And I mean it in one sentence. Yeah, says the professor.
Never ask a philosopher for one sentence. So I think it's a war of attrition, sort of devoid really of any serious debate about vision and ideas.
Okay. Liz, well done, Duncan.
Well, I'm disappointed that what should have been a care election has turned into a khaki election.
Oh.
And a bit surprised that 3 weeks in, we haven't seen the ALP pushing their childcare plan, which is a key cost of living issue and a critical piece of economic reform that could really push the coalition to, raise the, to meet their standard.
Okay, a bit of a zinger there from Liz. Thank you, Liz. And actually, they did do a launch on childcare today.
They did.
But was it high profile? No, it wasn't. No. Kish.
Well, I'm kind of a bit bored, but you guys are clearly excited enough to be here to hear us talk about it. I will say, though, look, it's felt like a disjointed, vision-free, and at times quite unedifying scrap so far.
Okay, vision-free, boring and unedifying. Anika.
Too bloody long.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that'll do. Stop right there. Anthony.
I was just going to say interminable.
Okay. Great, so we're getting the vibe. Okay, we've got the vibe. Anthony, there is no election coverage in my mind without you. So before we go any further, I want to ask you, as a very close watcher of election campaigns for a long time now, is there anything different that you're seeing about this election campaign? Anything that marks it from previous campaigns?
Well, I think we're seeing an increasingly, each election is a bit further down that track of not being really about set-piece debates about policy. More and more campaigning is about messaging rather than policy. And so you're seeing phrases of the day. And there's more and more of that occurring. And I think it's just quite extraordinary to watch sometimes. It makes it very difficult to actually cover an election campaign if it comes down to such short grabs on stuff.
Yeah. And I guess we'll be discussing this, so you wonder whether people bother to tune in for that, really. Antony, let's clear up this at the beginning. We got a question from someone in the audience earlier about polling. We were all obviously felt completely misled by the polls in 2019, and most of the polls have acknowledged they got it wrong. Is the polling, there have been changes to the methodology. Do you have a sense of whether the polling is more accurate this time around? Can we have a sense of that? And how much can it tell us before all the votes are cast?
Did you say more accurate?
More accurate.
We can only know that afterwards.
Yeah. That's true.
They've put a lot of effort into improving it, but we won't know if they've done enough and whether it's accurate until afterwards.
Well, from your sense of what they have done, their changes to their methodology, can we have any faith that is a better method?
No, Because, look, the simple problem they have in the United States, they cannot get Trump supporters to answer polls. Right? That's what's gone wrong with polling there. Remember, polling doesn't always work. If you went to Europe until about the 1980s, opinion polls were basically unknown on the continent. You couldn't do an opinion poll. People wouldn't tell you how they voted. They'd lived through 2 world wars, fascism, all that sort of stuff. They wouldn't tell you who they voted for. I think there's some people in society now will not tell you who they vote for. Now, I don't think that's as big a problem here.
In the age of social media, people tell you everything about their lives all the time.
Yeah.
So what the hell?
But I think that's why. Look, we'll have to assess it afterwards. But
all right.
Yeah.
And just before I move to the general discussion, we know this election will not be won on a national swing anyway. So what are the polls telling us? It'll be won in a small number of seats in a smaller number of states. Can we find out anything much from perhaps the leaders' movement so far about which states this will be won or lost in? Or are you clear on that?
It will be the government to hold office has to hold its seats in Queensland and Western Australia. If it loses seats, it has to win seats in other states. It has a very narrow path to victory, but I said that last time as well. But it's even harder this time, particularly with the way Western Australia has turned in the last few years. I think there's a bit of an over-concentration on individual seats. The seats, while you don't get a national swing in that way, the swing is relatively uniform in each state. They didn't win the last election with individual seats in Queensland. They won it with a 4.5% swing. So I think there's a tendency to mistake...
Yes, but that 4.5% swing was not the swing in every state. I mean, the
no,
swing
but it was in
Queensland.
That's what I mean, is that it's a state... The swings are distributed around the state swing. They're not distributed around the national swing. So that's why the first thing to watch for on election night is what's happening in Queensland and Western Australia. It can't be the first thing in Western Australia, of course, because they're 2 hours behind.
Okay.
But you'll see a reliable swing there. New South Wales is a bit both ways. And then you may get a significant swing in Victoria, but it doesn't deliver any seats. So there's a bit of a peculiarity around the country.
All right, so in other words, we all have to stay tuned to you, glued to the set on Saturday, May the 21st. Let's talk about what is happening in this campaign. And this week, it's very much about the economy. Now, the economy is always pretty much central to election campaigns. This week, though, we got that inflation figure of 5.1%. Kish, as the sort of generalist completely enmeshed in everything at the moment through this, that highest inflation number in 20 years sent a bit of a shock, I think, through the campaign bunkers, particularly of the election. Josh Frydenberg really couldn't hide his shock, I think, at that election campaign. Both sides started off, though, with an economic message. Who do you think that high inflation rate and potentially the impact of that on rates works for or against?
Well, look, it can't be good news for a government that has sort of pinned a lot of its chances of re-election on being the kind of steady hand of economic management. The coalition, I think, would have initially wanted this to be a debate about handling of the economy, because there is this sort of, I guess it's a bit of a meme around in Australian politics that the coalition are superior economic managers. But that being said, this is an inflation rate we haven't seen for 2 decades, and those cost of living pressures, this isn't just purely an academic thing. This is something that people are feeling at the petrol pump every day. It's something they're feeling every time they go to kind of, buy their groceries and stuff like that. And that's something that really affects how people vote. So, a big part of the coalition's strategy to get re-elected was, look, compared to the rest of the world, our unemployment is, our economy's doing okay. The COVID situation's okay. We're here. We might not be the most popular party around. You might not like Scott Morrison's vibe, but hold your nose, stick with the devil you know. It gets a little bit harder for them to make that pitch when you've got this historically high inflation rate, and if the RBA does what's expected and pushes up cash rate next week. The last time that happened was 2 weeks out before John Howard lost government in 2007. And, there's some symmetry to that, isn't there?
But do you think that the Prime Minister holding up that graph saying, look at the inflation rate in New Zealand, look at it in Canada, and look where we are, how great are we? And that international comparison that's being made across a whole number of areas, do you think that is persuasive to the voters?
Well, it might be persuasive to some because,
Are you persuaded by it?
Well, I'm not going to tell you how I vote. But, look, At the end of the day, people aren't persuaded by graphs, right? They're not persuaded by the rest of the world. They're persuaded by their own sort of personal experience. So look, even if it is worse than the rest of the world, when suddenly you go and petrol is at prices it's not been in years, that's what you're really thinking. That's what you're feeling. And that's how kind of, I think, regular people will probably be weighing up when they go to the ballot box.
Well, Anika, a lot of regular people will be panicking right about now, I think, about an interest rate rise. A lot. I mean, 60% of mortgage holders have variable interest rates, so things are going to go up. Do you think that changes the game in any way? In which way?
Yes, I do. And I think it changes the game because it takes the election campaign out of the control of the two major parties. So it's an event that punctuates the campaign that they haven't
Because
really
the Reserve Bank
prepared
Board
for.
is independent.
It's completely independent, and it will lift or not lift interest rates according to its own decision next week. So it affects the campaign in that way, and it negatively affects the government. As Kishor mentioned, we have precedent for this. This happened in 2007, just before John Howard lost government, and it affects them also because we see the Liberal Party as the party that's traditionally associated with economic management. And even before the interest rate rise was an issue, I think the Liberal Party was on very shaky ground with that, with the cost of living pressures that were cited, also with, just to sort of also draw a parallel with national security as another element of debate that really privileges governments. National security was invoked very, very early on in the campaign as something that the government has lost control over too in the agenda. And the pandemic. We haven't seen the pandemic really eventuate so far in the campaign, but I think that's been kept off the table because, again, the government's record in management of that issue as a sort of a domestic security issue and a health issue hasn't been fantastic either.
But Duncan, the government's answer to why will people not count them down for an interest rate rise or inflation hike is because people understand that it's these very factors, these global factors like a pandemic, like a war in Ukraine, that are driving up the prices, so they won't count the government down on that.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was Tip O'Neill famously said, all politics is local. And I think at some level, it's going to be, as Kish said, what people are encountering, in their daily lives, in the shops, at the schools, how it's impacting their families. It's going to dominate a lot of the political campaigning. I think the really interesting thing, though, from my perspective, is the government's sense of ownership of responsibility for managing these global issues and how well they're able to, in a sense, frame those issues as a matter of trust and as a matter of being aligned with the values that the government is trying to sort of promote to the population. I think, like Anika, I feel like the Prime Minister is sort of losing the ability to control that agenda in a way that he probably thought was a strength to begin with, right? And I think that's something that I just felt it switched this week a bit.
Okay. Liz, I've seen polling, came out not long after the budget that I saw that suggesting women in outer suburban seats are more focused on cost of living and were most impressed by the cost of living measures in the Frydenberg budget. The $250 checks arrived this week for people. How do you see the cost of living affecting the women's vote? And does it even make sense for us to think of such a thing as the women's vote?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about cost of living.
Yep. Look, I think what we learned from the last election and from our colleague Sarah Cameron's work on the Australian Election Survey is that Australian women are increasingly voting for Labor and the Greens, right? So you'd think after the couple of years we've had, just in terms of the pandemic of disrespect and the abject failure of the coalition to manage that at all, and the fact that Australian women lost more jobs and hours than Australian men, even though we've bounced back to historic highs in participation rates. You would think that trend is going to continue. But I think the thing that cautions me is that in the 2019 election, the ALP took to the Australian public a really comprehensive set of policies that the research evidence would suggest was going to really shift the dial on gender equality. And what did Australian women do? Well, 37% of them voted for Labor and the rest didn't. So I think it's really hard to read the women's vote. Cost of living pressures, I think, always play pretty strong for household managers. We know that women are predominantly the ones that are doing most of the kind of household management, so they're very attentive to these. And this is why I think issues like childcare could really cut through and shift that debate.
Okay,
that
so
vote.
your opening comment about you're hoping for a care election, we're getting a
Yeah.
Crikey one. Well, Labor's slogan is all about care.
Yeah.
It's Medicare, aged care,
Absolutely.
childcare, labour cares.
So, they need to be shouting that out. I mean, I think Australian women...
But does that, as you say, that doesn't necessarily trump the hip pocket?
No, it's a complex interplay, right? But if they're actually serious about those policies and they can get them out and really talk about them in clear detail, that's going to change. Like their commitment to paid wages for aged care workers, their childcare plan, all these things could really lift the wages of highly feminised care workers. That is a cost of living issue, right? Because the piece that wasn't talked about in this cost of living, in the kind of interest rate and inflation rate debate, is that plays out. There's 3 prongs to that problem: wages, inflation, and interest rates. And wages have been flat for a decade. And so if we've got these policies that could see some uplift, it's going to moderate concerns around inflation and interest rates.
Okay. Duncan, scare campaigns, they emerged very early in this campaign. We're all used to them, but they really, to come out in week 2, surprised me. The fact that they're coming out, and they're all the ones we've heard before, also surprised me, but then I'm easily surprised, I suppose. Party strategists are adamant that scare campaigns work and voters are driven more by fear than inducements, than positive offerings. Do you think that's true? And if it is, does it come at a cost?
Look, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in part. So it is something that people say, well, it works, that's why it happens. I mean, my dad used to say, you get the politicians you deserve, right? And there is something, I think, profound about that. And I think we have to ask ourselves, are we asking enough of our politicians and enough of our parties? It's very easy for us to complain, as I did, about the lack of vision, about the lack of a genuine contest of ideas, about often the contradictory impulse that we have towards, we want a debate about ideas, but the minute a politician says something slightly edgy or controversial, wham, they get hammered. And the media and the politicians are responding to something they see in the culture. So I think it's a real problem for our political system as a whole. And
I suppose we've seen that writ large, haven't we, with the trans women debate
Absolutely.
around the Warringah candidate, the captain's pick.
Absolutely. So there's a sense in which that's a genuinely important, serious issue. There's a profound shift in our culture around gender and sexuality. And
it's complex.
It's complex. It requires nuance. It requires debate. There are genuine debates to be had. And yet we seem to be incapable of having them. I mean, let alone debates about climate. Like, where is climate in this election right now? It is an existential threat to the planet. And yet we have, technology, not taxes, and a kind of race to the bottom from the other side of politics to make sure they don't scare the horses. So I think there's something about populism right now that our system has to grapple with. Populism has a dirty word, but we need to find a way to engage people about these complex issues that do scare them, but we shouldn't be indulging in that fear. And that, I think, is one of the big questions for liberal democracies as a whole right now.
Okay, but the we is all of us. We will come back and talk more about climate too. Don't worry about that. But Anika, obviously true. The more scare campaigns you have, the less room there is for policy debate. Will voters notice? Do they care? I mean, the voters are the we, and we're all responsible for this?
Yeah, well, I think that parties use scare campaigns because they are effective in a campaign, because they expose 2 things. They expose the parties to vulnerability in terms of policy detail and policy complexity. And Australian political debates and campaigns, and this one is no exception, are not good at articulating policies and having complex debates over policy. And part of that is cultural. Part of that is also, isolating Australia as a very interesting comparative example is we're a democracy where our political parties before elections aren't compelled or required, and they don't, release policy manifestos. In Europe, in the UK, in Canada, all the parties have got really detailed policy manifestos, and that sort of forms the basis for a much more robust discussion around policy issues at elections. It doesn't eliminate scare campaigns, but it certainly allows the parties and the voters to talk about some of the detail behind those policies.
I think if you ask Bill Shorten, he'd say not only does it not eliminate scare campaigns, it opens them up. I mean, he did have a significant Labor going into that had a significant policy manifesto.
But if Liberal had the same, then it would be a more even playing field.
Okay.
Houston had one as well.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. Kishor, you've drilled down, I know, into these scare campaigns and scare campaigns of the past. What did you unearth in terms of why the parties resorted to them so early?
I mean, we've talked about them. They work, right? Like, they're really, really effective. If you look at the last two elections, scare campaigns have played a huge part. In 2016, Labor sort of winked about the Libs destroying Medicare, and it played a huge part in Bill Shorten really overperforming or pushing the government to the brink. The last election, I mean, there were so many. This one about, Labor bringing in a death tax, a retirement tax, that it was going to destroy coal mines. And a lot of that stuff, it wasn't necessarily megaphone from the leaders. It wasn't even necessarily, driven by the media as well. It just often operated in this kind of like subaltern space through social media. It just became an idea that caught on. And once that idea catches on, it's really, really effective. And they're replaying the greatest hits this time around. I mean, that stuff about the death tax and the retirement tax has been simmering away through Facebook. Both sides are doing it. Labor have really talked about the Liberals putting all pensioners onto the cashless welfare card. Like, there's no basis for that. The government repeatedly says, no, we're not going to do that.
There's no way on this earth a coalition government would do that.
We're not going to do
pensions.
it. And then, Labor, Albanese or senior Labor shadow ministers get questioned about it. They're like, well, look at this statement that they made that could plausibly be spun as pointing to that like 5 years ago. So really, that's the thing. They need a kernel of truth to it and a kind of disengaged electorate that's not paying a huge amount of attention. And then, that's it.
And then is there another category of scare campaign? I'm thinking, the government wanted, as you noted, Liz, this election to have a national security feel to it. They really thought that would resonate well for them. I think Labor traditionally is wary of the electorate is wary of Labor on national security. That really wasn't getting much traction, and then lo and behold, we got the China-Solomons Security Pact smack bang in the middle of it all. Duncan, does that come into the category of scare campaigns, do you think? I mean, it's a significant foreign policy issue. We had a debate sort of around the issue, and some elements of the electorate did. But from the government's point of view, is that just a scare campaign?
No, look, I'm not sure it's a scare campaign. I mean, it's, events happen, and it's one of those inevitable sort of unanticipated events that emerges in a campaign. It comes down to how the parties are able to frame those issues in terms of the values and the broader framework they're providing to the Australian public. And I think, I think most of us were saying at the beginning, that space has just been so attenuated now, as Antony said, year after year, that it's very hard to make sense of the differences and the important differences that one could take to that issue in particular, right? Like, what is our Pacific? What is our agenda for the Pacific? I mean, what should our engagement with the Pacific be? How do we actually think about these issues in a broader foreign policy and value-informed way? That's just completely missing. So inevitably, when the events occur, we're left with the kind of the politics of it in the pure sense, rather than those broader debates.
But is that partly because there's not actually much difference between
Correct.
the policies of both sides? I mean, they actually both have the same formula.
So here's the question.
In this case, by and large.
Here's the question. Is that because we've had a robust conversation about Australia's role in the Pacific, and we've arrived at a kind of communal consensus about the appropriate way to handle this? Well, I don't think so. Something else has happened.
Is that because of that or not?
Look, I think it came along as another sort of opportunity for the government to create and frame a crisis and try to exploit a crisis, national security. And I think that it's sort of lost steam because it is such a difficult policy issue, and both political parties are going to have trouble sort of convincing the voters that they have the track record on it. And it's also a complex issue because it doesn't just end at the Solomons. It's picks up China as well, and that's the bigger problem.
It does pick up China, and you'd have to think that does perhaps fall into the category of scare campaign. But just before we leave this, the government is saying privately and public, really. As long as it's talking about national security, they feel like they're on their territory and it works for them. Labor did find that very strong sort of rhetorical attack line of the worst foreign policy failure in the Pacific since the Second World War. Do you have a sense of which side feels like they're winning this skirmish?
Well, yeah, look, traditionally the coalition thinks national security is good for them. They really wanted this to be a khaki election. You know, all the kind of sound bites and the messaging before the campaign was Labor can't be trusted with this scary world out there with war and China and all that kind of thing. And some of the stuff Peter Dutton and Morrison were saying in Parliament was, calling Richard Marles a Manchurian candidate of the Chinese Communist Party. It was this insane language. But look, I think it's just like stepping away. And I think the Solomons issue has made it harder for them because it is, I think, a clear failure. But on foreign policy, I think this has actually been a pretty poor government on that kind of stuff. It's felt like the way they've handled diplomacy. I mean, look at Macron and AUKUS has been often very impulsive. There's been a sidelining of DFAT and sort of the diplomats and how they've done things. There was at times a far too cozy relationship with Donald Trump. We've kind of forgotten about all of that. The way they've dealt with China could often be, obviously the relationship with China has been really fraught, but very tactless at times. So really, it's interesting that the government still thinks of this as a strong point because I don't think it's been particularly good on these issues.
Yes,
and
but...
to jump in there, Fran, the complete slashing of the foreign aid budget.
Which happened under the Abbott government
Which
initially.
it started then and just has kept going because it's not a vote winner, right? So it's an easy line item to kind of slash each budget that comes along. And so then your friends are left hanging out to dry. And I think it's been interesting that the ALP's response to the current crisis has actually been a bit of a return to a standard way of treating the Pacific. So, investing in labour programs, labour mobility programs, even enhancing those, allowing Pacific labour workers to bring their families, those kinds of things. So,
no commitment yet on Labor on where they're going to set foreign aid, is there?
No, not that I've heard of.
Yeah.
Just a commitment to, bump it back up.
Yeah, okay, but just leaving that, just coming back to a question that came in a little earlier that I missed from Adam. Associate Professor Hill mentioned Labor wasn't shouting their care policies from the rooftops, and the media often mentions voters not truly knowing Anthony Albanese. To what extent is this Labor's fault? Is the media not responsible for not covering the ALP? Do you have a sense of that? I mean, I have a view on that, but...
No, my view, we've had almost 3 weeks and they're not shouting loud enough. They've got good policies that really respond to the crisis in our care systems that was exposed by the pandemic. It's a strong card. Why wouldn't you be playing it? And it is, as I said, it's a cost of living. It's an everyday issue that gets negotiated at the household level. So I'm perplexed as to why they haven't talked more about it. They've got a lot to say.
I have views. Does anyone on this panel have a view on why Labor's not? Because I agree with you. I've been saying it myself.
Not so much Labor, but I think it's a peculiarity of Australian politics that every policy has a cost attached. And
I think they're fighting the last election.
You're constantly buried by the numbers about how much policy costs. There's not a principled argument about this is good policy. It's all turned into the budget. And I think it's something we've had in our politics since the 80s.
I mean, this is I just spent the last week in Canada, and some people, and Liz and I were chatting about before, Quebec has had originally $5, now $10 a day daycare for 30 years. And there's been a huge amount of research, assessment, evaluation of the policy. Justin Trudeau's just put $30 billion on the table. Now, what was interesting, when the announcement was made in the budget last week, the Conservative Party in Canada was like, it's a good policy.
Yeah.
We support it. So, look, there is hope, right? Like, there are other places where you can have, reasonable debates about these things. So, it goes back to Anthony, but why, and there could be a reasonable debate about the best form of childcare. So, for example, in Quebec...
But there's so much research on it.
Exactly.
We know the research is there, but that gets very little coverage.
So I think it also points to our failure of current governments in the last few elections to actually pitch economic reform. We haven't had, as many commentators say, reasonable economic reform, since the GST? It's a long time ago. And yet we know from the research, we're now a service economy, high rates of participation by women. What kind of social service systems do we need to support that, to unleash women's labour supply? You know, we're the most highly educated in the world, ranked number 1 globally, and we pitch up at 70th in terms of economic participation and opportunity. I mean, it's pathetic. Why would you waste that kind of resource? And governments talk about productivity, they talk about growth, but they certainly haven't shifted to investing in the kinds of economic reform like early childhood education and care, universal and free, and like a generous paid parental leave.
And the
scheme.
package we got from Labor today, as you say, not shouting for the rooftop, but they announced it last year, and the small change we got from the government in the budget, does that go close to?
Oh, we have so far to go. And, you know, Canada just really shows us up that, you know, $30 billion to build a national community early childhood education and care system. I mean, that's vision. That changes how households operate. That changes the kinds of decisions that men and women can make about how they work and how they care. We've got everything to benefit from that. Well-being, prosperity, productivity, growth, you know, frame it any way you like.
Okay. Let's go to climate. It's the perennial scare campaign, but let's not deal with it just on that level. I mean, because that has left us with policy stagnation, no doubt about it. We've seen more of it this week. Scott Morrison labelling Labor's policy, which is essentially implementing the government's policy, a sneaky carbon tax. Duncan, I know you mentioned already you've been waiting for this to come up in the campaign. We've got it in this kind of turgid way this week. I'm assuming this is not the way you've been wanting it to come up.
No, look, I think it is a really a prime example of here you have a kind of existential threat facing the planet. You have a lot of rich policy, a lot of rich thinking going on about how best to address the planet's warming and the consequences for us. You have a country like Australia that, if it's not burning, is drowning. And you have a population, I think, basically begging, I think, the political system to engage them in this debate, and yet it's not happening. I think it's too easy to say the natural resources industry is crushing the debate. In many ways, they have moved further than the government on many of the mainstream issues. So why isn't it happening? And I mean, I'm not a political scientist. Anika and others will have a better, I think, rationale for this. But it's almost as if, in this case, we talked about scare campaigns for the population. It's almost as if the political class has scared themselves into really tackling this issue in a significant way.
Have the political classes scared themselves, Anika, or have they seen how they can use it as a handy wedge? I mean, this week, we've seen the coalition at odds with itself over climate policy with the National Party Senator, LNP Senator, but Nat Canavan declaring net zero targets are dead. It's all over. It's dead around the world. He was slapped down publicly, sort of, by Scott Morrison and plenty of others. But is there a sense that everyone knows very clearly what Matt Canavan is doing? He's telegraphing a message in one part of the country. Scott Morrison and others are telegraphing a different message in another part of the country, in the major cities. So is that simply the answer why?
Well, it's that sort of mixed messaging, multi-messaging is a pretty standard technique, but I don't think climate change is the right topic or the right policy issue to do that, because it assumes, I think, that there are some distinct attitudes in the country and rural electorates around climate change, which we know is not the case. We know it's a complex policy issue. You have farmers who will see the longer term effects of climate change as being detrimental to their businesses and will support measures to reduce it. You'll have the resource industry who won't support measures to reduce it, obviously. So the way it plays out in regional Australia is far more complex than urban Australia supports climate change action, regional Australia doesn't.
But Labor would tell you, Bill Shorten would tell you last time, that it did cost him. Because the analysis, their post-election analysis said that seemed to be being sneaky, giving a different message there to here, didn't work very well. And it's certainly the coalition's climate scare resonated in the bush. That's what they would say.
Well, I think
now we're 3 years on.
Yeah, exactly. I think a difference of 3 years in this field has made a huge difference, and I think people's views are shifting, particularly as natural disasters are increasing, which affects a much more, it affects everybody in the electorate. It affects Liberal voters in the Upper North Shore as much as it does Labor voters in Western Sydney who are really, really hot, and also, people in the country.
Just two quick things, Fran, on that. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I do think there is something that social democratic parties probably have not got right, not just in Australia but elsewhere, and that is, there's this easy phrase, just transition. But what does that actually mean? What do you say to, a steel worker or, a pipe fitter who is earning, good wages, is able to support their family, live the lifestyle they want? It's not good enough to say, we'll find you great jobs in sort of renewables. I think that's one thing that hasn't really been, tackled, and that's contributed, to the stagnation. I think the other thing is, stepping back even further from the issue, is liberal democracies struggle increasingly with not just complexity, but long-term issues. How do you build a sustainable long-term policy approach when you've got 3-year election cycles, 24-hour media, sort of firestorms? That's a serious issue for liberal democracies more generally, I think.
Yeah, Kishor, I think that's true. I think the 3-year electoral cycles are a big part of that. But, the electorate, there is a sense, and certainly the business community, as has been said, have moved on, but the parties seem stuck in basically, they're frightened. They're frightened of being hammered again. They're frightened of moving forward with a big idea and actually, working it through. And those things are difficult. Labor did come out with quite a detailed policy, I suppose, last year around that transition, but not nearly as detailed as it needs to be for people to really trust that their job will be replaced. And there's no easy answer to that because it won't happen quickly.
No.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things when we're talking about the fear is that the 2019 election result was such a kind of shock and a surprise. And it was such a big shock and a surprise that it has really framed everything that's happened in the 3 years since in terms of how parties have thought about winning this next election. I think that's definitely framed a lot of the kind of fear around climate. It struck me, look, that both major parties, the Business Council, who called the shortened target in 2019 economy wrecking, are now demanding something more bold than both parties are putting out there, right? Look, both parties are trying to solve their own internal climate wars. For Labor, it's about threading that needle with the hunter and coal country in central Queensland and while also keeping the cities in check. And suddenly the Libs face this kind of teal issue that means that they can't really use the same messaging that Nat Canavan's using up in Rockhampton, over here in Rose Bay, right? It doesn't work anymore. And so that suddenly becomes really difficult for both parties to kind of thread that needle on climate. But one other last quick point there, when we're talking about people in the bush, and we're talking about people in these coal communities, I think that there is a slightly dismissive and patronising way in which we consider them as people that don't really understand issues like just transition, don't understand issues like, the inevitable end of the coal industry. In Flynn in central Queensland, which is one of those key seats with a lot of coal miners, more than half the electorate said that they thought climate was one of the most important issues, I think, or something like that.
Well, that's the point Anika was making, exactly. But I don't know if it's patronising or just a sense that these things mean different things for different people in different places. They have very different meaning, and you've got to figure that out. You've got to go in there and spend a lot of time in those places and work out your policies and be brave enough to explain those to people, exactly as John Howard did for several years before he introduced the GST, this will cost you in some places, but we are going to make it up with this reimburse you here and give you this credit here. And, that was a hard argument and a hard slog for Peter Costello and John Howard. We haven't seen that kind of effort on anything since then. You brought up the teal issue, as you call it. Let's go to that because there's a fair bit of interest from the audience too. Climate is certainly a unifying issue for the so-called teal independents, as is the National Integrity Commission, of course. Let's talk about the impact, Antony, I'll come to you on this, of the independents and the minor parties on the left and the right of this campaign. You talk about partisan de-alignment. What does that mean and what's happening?
Well, I mean, our parties still have the shadows. Most Australia's... when I was studying politics 30, 40 years ago, the standard description of party systems around the world was, apart from Belgium and Canada, they were the same as in 1920. Now, some of that is unpicked since, but Australia is one of the oldest stable party systems in the world, and it still has the shadows of, we've got three parties, Party of Labor, Party of Urban Capital, and the Party of Rural Capital, and that's what they are still named as, and that shadow has come down through inherited allegiances, but that's not the alignments we have today. I mean, I remember 1996 was the first really big sign of it, since that was the year that Labor lost Hughes for the first time. This was a seat which has got the highest proportion of trades workers.
The Howard Battlers.
And the like. Well, it's more that the way they relate to the workforce changed over the previous decade as the privatisation of the big corporations, the outsourcing, those sorts of things which turned people who were traditionally wage earners into self-employed. It changes the way they relate. And you're seeing that now with, say, the Hunter Valley. You're seeing, coal miners are, compared to chicken gutters and other people who are working class, they are the royalty of the working class. They are high-paid, working for large corporations, generally heavily unionised. So they're a different sort of worker who's often more affected by things like tax policy than they are by wages conditions policy. So there's that sort of de-alignment's occurring on one side of the Labor Party, aggravated by the climate change issues. And on the other side of politics, you've got people who are traditional liberals who don't like some of the more populist way political issues are expressed nowadays in modern campaigning. They are concerned about integrity. They are concerned about climate change. And you say, and they, there's a term that was used, grew in prominence in about 2004, which I hated, which was doctors' wives, dismissing people because they're it's just one of those horrible terms. He says, "Oh, it's only because you're rich you can care about human rights." Well, people do care about human rights, and it is important they care about them, and it's just not something that can be dismissed. And so it's the same de-alignment occurring on both sides, and just still so simply, people don't define themselves by their job like they used to. So that's the other aspect of it.
Can I just ask you, before we get to, because of people wanting to know who's going to win in Kooyong Wentworth, Anthony, so I should add, but let's talk about Clive Palmer, because last time around he had a massive influence, I think, on the outcome of the campaign. Not because for his $80 million he got anyone elected, but a big slab of that went in anti-Bill Shorten ads and anti-Labor ads. Labor credits that, I think, particularly with their loss in Queensland. Are we going to see that kind of impact again from Clive Palmer? Can we say yet?
I don't know. I mean, I have been waiting for months. When is he going to pivot? What's he going to do?
Well, it happened late last time.
It happened late last time, and it just flooded Labor's campaign, and it's why not only their first preference vote down, but it was why flows of preferences to Labor was so weak last time. It's not how to vote cards that cause preference flows. It's the whole attitude of what people think, where should my next preference go? And it was the strongest flow of preferences from one nation and Palmer United in Australia we'd ever seen before at the last election. And it was built around that message you get across. Everything I've ever seen, I've been doing a lot of work on this in the last 2 or 3 years. It's not how to votes and preference deals that cause preference flows. It's where people think their preferences should go. And most people tend to make up their own mind in one way or other on that sort of issue. Now, I don't know what he's going to do in the next 3 weeks. What's he going to do? What's his changed message? If he doesn't shift to saying preference the coalition, if he continues...
He says he won't.
If he runs off and continues to frolic on the anti-vax mandate stuff, if he's still on that, the preference flows from that group are going to be a bit more general and all over the place. Yeah. And remember last time in Queensland, the Liberal vote did not go up. Labor's votes fell. It was a third-party vote that went up, and there was stronger preference.
William Bowe, poll bludger, has done some research on this and suggests that the United Palmer vote is strongest in Victoria. Much stronger it is in Victoria, for instance, than it is in WA, which would be a shift from last time. That would be surprising in some ways, but that's all about the anti-vax.
I'm waiting to see how the actual result comes out.
What about the so-called independents? In the past few elections, independents have looked like, particularly last time around, being a real chance in some of those seats. A seat like Kooyong, Josh Frydenberg was extremely worried. I must say he was looking a little worried today, I thought, too. But will it be any different this time, do you think? Well, let me ask the question from who's asked me this. David, independents, will they win in Kooyong and Wentworth? Thanks, David. Great.
They will win some seats. I mean, I would suspect it's most likely to win 2 or 3. Don't ask me which ones. But the Kooyong one was Julian Burnside as a Green last time. Now, if he'd been an independent, he might have had a better chance of winning. Often, you have a better chance of winning as an independent. I always say that independents win because of their names. There isn't one party MP in that parliament at the moment, who's in parliament, who's elected because of who they are. They were all elected because they had a party label. No independent is elected because of the word independent on the ballot paper. They're elected because when voters turn up, they know who the name is.
Do you think that's true of Helen Haynes?
She inherited...
Rebecca Sharkey?
Just because Helen Haynes...
Rebecca came in a party.
Well, Rebecca Sharkey was elected as a Nick Xenophon candidate.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a name.
Look, the Voices of Indi is effectively a political party for Indi. And also, the other thing I would say, country electorates are different. If you're a candidate and you don't have 60 to 70% recognition in a country election, you can't win. If you can get 30 or 40 in a city electorate, you're doing well.
Yeah. Anika, do you see signs that's any different this time in terms of the fate of the prospects of the independents?
Yeah, look, I think there is a lot that's different this time in this election campaign, and I think there's a sort of a confluence of a perfect storm, a number of factors. And the first, as Anthony mentioned, that longer-term decline in the party vote. The second goes to that question that's been asked a lot in the media, and that Jason Falinsky was talking about last night is, and Anthony mentioned, are these independents or are they political parties?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because the way in which they are organising, the strategies that they have, the sophistication of the strategies, the resources, the groundswell of support, the mobilisation tactics that they're employing at the moment, they are way more effective than political parties at the moment in mobilising supporters in these places. So I actually think, irrespective of the success of individual independents, we are seeing quite an interesting shift away from the major parties to a different type of political organisation and mobilisation, which I think, started in Indi. It was quite prominent it's been prominent with Voices for. I know Voices for movements have been mobilising for the last 2 years in many rural electorates, and I can see that continuing.
Okay.
And maybe it's a response. Sorry, Fran. Maybe it's a response to this need for more complexity in our system to account for the more complex preferences and beliefs that people have to begin with, right? I'm sure there's lots of other explanations for, why different independents are running on the basis they are. But if we take a step back, we're seeing it happen in a sort of negative way in other parts of the world. Orban, Trump, obviously. But, another way to think of it is, well, our political system is actually slowly, creakingly responding to the fact that people have complex beliefs that aren't tightly aligned with either their job profile or the suburb they live in.
We're going to run out of time very quickly. There will be time for a few questions at the end, so don't worry. But I want to go to, I can't remember who brought this up, but the fact that, Anika, was it you, that the pandemic really hasn't factored yet in this campaign. Someone's mentioned that. A few months ago, I was saying in my podcast and all over the place that this election would be a referendum on Scott Morrison's handling of the pandemic. Well, it hasn't been. It's barely been mentioned. Liz, for the hundreds and thousands of women in the frontline roles responding to the pandemic, the nurses, the aged care workers, the retail staff, is the pandemic still front of mind for them? And will they judge the government on the handling of it?
Good, that's a great question. I think considering that it was really only March that households were starting to kind of return to some kind of normal, I would like to think it's still in their minds, and they're still, we know from our research, Ray Cooper and my research, that those women are really, they were, as we like to say, whiplashed and weary on account of the pandemic experience. Work went up and down, care piled up, and by the end of the year, they were kind of like exhausted and like, how are we going to do this? By March, they were kind of really thinking about, well, what does work and care, what does our life look like going forward? And I would have thought that would still be present in April and even the end of May. And I would hope that they're looking to the political parties to frame what their possible future might be. And that is really strongly connected to the kinds of wages and conditions that they receive. As we've said, we've seen flat wages growth. Public sector wages cap has led to, a real flattening of wages, and we've had strikes of teachers and nurses, at least in New South Wales. We've had our Premier telling us that he will address that in the June budget. But I think those things, if that doesn't play out in the election, I'm kind of bit perplexed.
Well, Kish, Liz can live in hope, but the reality is the parties are not really trying to raise the pandemic much as an issue. Labor has a wages policy, but it struck me that in that first Sky debate, a lot of people may not have seen it, but what was striking about it to me was every question asked from the floor was on one of Anthony Albanese's issues, basically. But on the aged care nurse workforce question, he didn't really hammer the wages thing very much. He didn't knock that out of the park, I didn't think. I mean, why isn't the pandemic featuring here? Does it surprise you?
A couple of things. Firstly, people are really, really sick and tired of talking or hearing about the pandemic and have, I think, just like emotionally moved on, and the politicians know that.
Except for all those hundreds of thousands of people with COVID at the moment.
Yeah, but I think as well, because a lot of people, they've either had it, they've known people who've had it, and it has been, by and large, actually pretty okay for a lot of them. Obviously, not for the many who have had it really badly, not for the thousands who have died this year, but people do want to move on. There is that sense in the community, there's a weariness. The second thing is that COVID, I think, is awkward for both parties. For Morrison, you know, it's a reminder of where they did fail on the vaccine rollout. How that summer this year where everything was just super chaotic and the government just
the rats.
wanted to go on holiday and not talk about it. And for Labor, I think it's a little bit awkward as well, because this was something Morrison was gearing up to make this a freedom election for a long time last year. He wanted to say, look, Labor's going to put you back in lockdown if you vote for them. And, you know, that's why Labor had to be so careful with their messaging on things like reopening and stuff like that, because anytime they looked like there was an inkling that they might be on the side of tougher restrictions, the government could just be like, you're going to Dan Andrews everyone and put you in lockdown forever. Right. So awkward for both parties. No one wants to talk about it anymore. And I think that's a big reason why it hasn't featured in the debate so far.
I suppose the issue is it could still be an underlying feature, or the underlying feature behind the unpopularity of Scott Morrison that keeps showing up. Sure, you know, people sort of red hot. Just on this, though, one thing I'm really waiting to appear in this campaign is a discussion about mental health. I mean, it's an enormous residual issue from this pandemic, enormous for people. There's plenty of surveys being done out there that show it as one of the top two issues for people, mental health emerging from the COVID. It's just not being talked about. Why not? Can anyone give me a sense of that? Duncan?
Oh, look, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's one of these issues that is hard and complex, and the pandemic exposed the lack of a coherent mental health system in Australia. There's lots of bits and pieces, but as my colleague Ian Hickey has said for many years now, we haven't tied the system together in a way that allows people to access the mental health care they need. I think we're going to see it emerging in collective bargaining, enterprise bargaining. I think we're going to see it in workplaces become more prominent. I think it's a slow burn, but it isn't featuring in this election. The one thing I would say, Fran, just to sort of push back a bit, I think it's too early to tell about the pandemic. One of the biggest issues potentially in this campaign will be the deficit. Why is the deficit so big? Because the government spent like never before to support people during the pandemic. And what's fascinating to me is people now have an expectation about government that has fundamentally changed. And that is a huge thing for the Liberal Party in particular to adapt to. And the politics of the deficit, I think, are a long-term consequence of the pandemic, not just in Australia, but across the Western world in particular.
I think that's true, but as we've been saying all night, you know, long-termism is not a feature of our political system, and at the moment, governments and oppositions are loving it because they can basically promise anything. People are expecting it.
The money.
No one's worried about the debt and deficit anymore. It's a completely changed atmosphere to 5 years ago. We are almost out of time. I did promise you the chance to ask questions here. We do have 2 roving mics. Do we have anyone with a question? We've got a question down here in the front. We've got Isabel and Talia wandering around. And then there's one here in the very front too.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I just give the usual caveat? Can we please have questions, not statements, and can you make them tight because we are almost out of time?
Indeed.
Thanks.
Julian Assange question. What should we do about Julian Assange?
Well, there's a curveball into the campaign. Anika. Come on.
Is that going to win votes? That's my answer.
Okay.
Is that going to win votes?
I'm asking you.
There's a lot of bipartisan support for the government leaning on the UK and actually trying to get him brought back to Australia. You'd be surprised how many Liberals want him brought back.
Barnaby Joyce, I think.
Barnaby Joyce is a big one. Well, George Christensen as well before he left the party. And a lot who will not put their name to it. But yeah.
But Penny Wong dodged it the other day.
They have been dodging it, yeah. I don't know why, honestly. I think that they...
Can I say that...
You can ask,
We're
you
after
can't
questions,
say.
not statements.
You can ask, you can't say. Ask. No, please, come on.
Well, look, I'm going to make a statement, and I saw a film last week with John Shipton, and he said that he had lunch with Anthony Albanese a week or two ago, and he said, Albanese on the record now saying enough. Despite the rights or wrongs of it, and absolutely there are rights and wrongs about it, but Albanese is on the public record saying enough.
And you know what that point does come? It came with, and I'm going to forget the name, but remember when John Howard, the guy who was in Guantanamo?
Yeah.
David Hicks.
David Hicks.
John Howard got that message. People thought, enough. This kid's just a kid. And I think that moment inevitably comes, but Labor's not going to make a peep of that before an election, I wouldn't suggest. There's another question just here.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. When I see policies like being promoted, like federal ICAC by Christmas, or 82% renewable energy by 2030, fixing aged care, etc., are we making the mistake that just because one side is promoting fewer policies than last time, we come to the immediate conclusion that there must be no vision at all, rather than perhaps there is just there's a vision, but it's just not over-promising, potentially compared to last time, because I just hear a lot of discourse about, there's no vision, when I'm of the view that there might be. Do you guys share?
It's a small target. Is that what it actually is, or is it just not, paying much attention to it, or is this says not shouting it from the rooftop?
Yeah, I agree with you that there's a lot of vision in the ALP's response to the aged care, even if it is just implementing the recommendations from the Royal Commission. But that seems to be visionary these days, responding to the advice of experts. Good on them. But again, that's a piece of social infrastructure. If all those plans for the ALP were rolled out, that causes a huge shift in the quality of life of residents and the quality of life and well-being of their families and the quality of life and well-being of the workers. So that is a vision, and that would form some fundamental change.
I mean, aged care, it's just a hunch really of mine, but you've got the research. Aged care, I'm pretty sure, is a vote changer for a lot of people, and that's why I think Labor's gone there in some degree. But it's not sort of resonating hugely in this election campaign. Do you think it is a vote changer for people?
Yeah, look, I mean, like Duncan, I'm not a political scientist, but I do know about social policy. And again, I guess, you would, given the numbers, given the absolute crisis, given the fact that...
The exasperation of it.
The exasperation, and the fact is that in terms of jobs growth, the most jobs growth is going to be in human and social services. That includes aged care and home care services. So doesn't that get some traction? This is what matters.
Well, the thing is there's not going to be jobs growth unless they start training the workforce. So
that's true.
There's a question up here from a woman in a yellow top that I can see.
Thank you. My question is simple and broad. Is the culture of Australian voters to vote governments out and not in?
Nice question.
Anika?
Yeah, well, that's pretty much the culture everywhere, I think. It's a sort of a natural response to the very sort of style of election campaigns as events, and it's particularly acute in Australia for the reasons that we've mentioned tonight, the 3-year cycle, the focus on sort of personality. I suppose that hasn't come up, but that's been ever more prominent over the years, and the lack of sort of focus on policy too. But I just wanted to piggyback off that question with another observation that I think draws together a few things that we've heard tonight. And Fran, you sort of asked the question, why is climate change not on the agenda? Climate change and also mental health.
Yeah, mental health.
And there's no coincidence that climate change and mental health are the top two issues of young Australians, of concern for young Australians. Yeah. And so my answer would be they're not on the agenda because young Australians aren't in parties. They are not integrated into our political system.
But they are enrolled. I think we've got the highest enrolment levels ever at the moment. I think it's 96% enrolment, which means there's a lot of young people on
Absolutely,
the
absolutely. So they're not there in the parties, in the parliaments, presenting these policies, but they are there in record numbers that will vote this year. And I think that's part of the parties haven't responded to
And
that.
it gets to that long-term, short-term issue. I mean, I've become increasingly persuaded by a argument of a colleague of mine, David Runciman in the UK, who's arguing that we should lower the voting age to 10 or 11. Just, and it's not being facetious, because just think about the issues we're facing. And then I'm sure, Anika, you can give us the data on how old you are actually shapes your views about existential crises facing the planet, right? So I'm
now you're
increasingly
scaring
of the
little
view-
kiddies, that's what they'd say.
That's right.
But also we've
I'm
had,
in grave danger of losing control of this debate just as we're about to end, so I'm going to stop you, Liz.
Okay, no worries.
But everyone gets a
Enfranchise
last
the
shot.
10-year-olds.
Thanks for the questions from the audience, but we are out of time. So let's end on a hopeful note. It's sort of the same question asked at the beginning, but put in a hopeful way, which is, what do you hope for in the last 3 weeks? Liz, you can go first, because I cut you off.
I would like politicians to listen to younger voters and face up and confront them and answer their responses. And they're avoiding that at the moment.
Okay. Duncan?
Yeah, just don't underestimate the Australian public. And in a sense...
what would you hope to see in the last 3 weeks then?
Oh, I think I'd like to see the parties taking a bit more risk with the ideas that are there, as Liz and others have said, in their platforms, and really push them out and engage the public on them.
Annika?
I'd like to see leaders other than the two major party leaders participate in debates. And we're going to have some election debates coming up, at least one, if not two more.
So you want
I want
Anna Bant there?
I want the full.
Clive Palmer?
I want the full range of voices that are in this campaign to be present in those debates.
It's an electrifying idea, isn't it? Anthony?
I'm a
You're
big
not
fan.
getting off scot-free, don't worry.
I mean, look, I happen to think that the Reserve Bank decision next Tuesday might determine the whole future of this campaign and determine the last 3 weeks, but we'll see what happens. I mean, if they make a decision next Tuesday, I think the campaign will go off on a very different tangent.
Sorry to be a journalist on you, but that wasn't my question. What would you like to see?
Part of my response to that is simply, I actually barely see any of the campaign.
Oh,
I'm so
fair
buried,
enough.
so,
Keith, last word from you.
Look, Australia's got one of the whitest parliaments of any in the Western world. And I don't think the major parties are really doing enough to change that, but I would like to see a few more diverse candidates both get up, which I think will happen, and also I think, voters in very migrant-heavy parts of Sydney and Melbourne will decide this election. So let's see what they decide.
All right, well, on that note, thank you. Could you please thank a panel? Duncan Ivison, Liz Hill, Anika Gauja, Kishor Napier-Raman and Antony Green. Thank you. And can I say thanks to you, all of you, for coming out on a sort of pretty wet and drab night, really, in Sydney, to the Sydney Ideas Forum. They're always fantastic. There's more coming up. There'll be some in May. I personally can't wait for post-election part 2 that was promised to us by Lisa earlier. So if you want to find out more, head to the Sydney Ideas website. And again, thank you, all of you. And, vote well, vote often. You know what they say. Thank you.